4 generations, the Beatles have been celebrated as the greatest band in music history. Their songs changed popular music forever, but behind their incredible success was a far more personal story. Paul McCartney and George Harrison were not simply fellow musicians sharing the same stage. They were close friends who grew up together, supported one another through difficult times, and eventually found themselves divided by creative differences and personal struggles. Their relationship was built on loyalty and affection, yet it was also marked by rivalry, misunderstanding, and years of emotional distance. When George Harrison passed away, Paul was left reflecting on a lifetime filled with unforgettable memories, remarkable achievements, and regrets that could never be erased. To understand how their friendship evolved, it is necessary to return to Liverpool, where everything began. Long before the Beatles became a worldwide phenomenon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were simply 2 schoolboys with a shared love of music. Their friendship started in 1954 while they were both students at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was 1 year older than George and had already earned a reputation for being intelligent, humorous, and naturally gifted with music. George, meanwhile, was quieter and more reserved. He often felt uncomfortable in the school's strict environment and later admitted that those years were among the unhappiest of his life. Although they attended the same school, their friendship did not develop inside the classroom. Instead, it grew during the daily bus rides into Liverpool. Those journeys allowed them to escape the discipline and routines of school life, replacing lessons and homework with conversations about guitars, songs, and their favorite performers. George noticed Paul regularly carrying his guitar, and that simple observation sparked conversations that quickly revealed how much they had in common. At the time, Britain was experiencing the skiffle craze, a style of music that inspired thousands of young people to believe they could start bands without expensive equipment or formal training. Paul and George became completely absorbed by this musical movement. They admired American rock and roll legends including Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Buddy Holly. George was especially fascinated after hearing Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel for the first time. The sound captivated him, motivating him to spend countless hours drawing guitars in his notebooks and practicing chords until his fingers became sore. Music was already an important part of Paul's life. His father, Jim McCartney, had played in a jazz band during the 1920s, creating a home where music was always present. Paul first learned the piano before teaching himself guitar, developing skills that impressed everyone around him. As he spent more time with George, he recognized that the younger boy possessed remarkable determination and genuine talent. Their 1-year age difference became meaningless because their shared passion for music connected them more strongly than anything else. George's ambition soon became obvious. In 1956, he formed a small skiffle band called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a close friend. Rather than treating music as a pastime, George already dreamed of making it his future. Around the same time, Paul had joined John Lennon's group, the Quarrymen. When the band needed another guitarist, Paul immediately recommended George, believing his friend had exactly the talent they required. John Lennon was not convinced at first. He thought George looked too young and lacked the maturity needed for the group. Everything changed one evening aboard a Liverpool bus when George demonstrated his guitar skills by performing Bill Justice's instrumental, Raunchy. His performance was so impressive that Lennon could no longer question his ability. George was welcomed into the band, completing the core lineup that would eventually become the Beatles. From that point onward, Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison spent endless hours together rehearsing, learning new techniques, exchanging musical ideas, and imagining a future that reached far beyond Liverpool. They taught each other chords, experimented with songwriting, and slowly developed the partnership that would transform popular music forever. For Paul, who had experienced the heartbreaking loss of his mother to cancer at just 14 years old, George's friendship provided comfort, companionship, and a renewed sense of purpose. For George, being accepted into the group offered something equally important. It proved that he belonged alongside musicians he admired and respected, giving him the confidence to pursue his ambitions with even greater determination. These early years established Paul as George's mentor and strongest supporter. However, they also laid the foundation for the challenges that would emerge later. As success, fame, and creative ambition grew, the friendship that had begun so naturally on Liverpool buses would face pressures neither of them could have imagined. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles had become the biggest band in the world. The excitement of performing together gradually gave way to the responsibilities of maintaining extraordinary success. Paul increasingly assumed leadership during recording sessions, driving the band's creative direction with remarkable energy and determination. He constantly searched for new sounds, demanded perfection, and carefully shaped the arrangements of their songs. While these qualities helped produce groundbreaking music, they also created tension within the group. George often felt that Paul's growing influence left little room for his own creative ideas. This became particularly noticeable during the recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. The album largely reflected Paul's artistic vision and would go on to redefine modern rock music. Yet George felt his contributions received far less attention than they deserved. His composition, Within You Without You, expressed his deep interest in Indian philosophy and spiritual music, making it one of his most personal works. Although Paul respected the song, he viewed it as one part of a larger concept album, whereas George saw it as an expression of his personal beliefs. Their different outlooks became even clearer during the Beatles' visit to India in 1968. George embraced meditation and spirituality with complete sincerity, believing those experiences had transformed his understanding of life. Paul approached the journey differently, often treating it with humor and seeing it as a temporary escape from the pressures of fame. He later remembered joking with George, encouraging him to relax and keep his sense of humor. George, however, felt that the Beatles had become too focused on business, commercial success, and recording albums, while ignoring the deeper spiritual values he had come to cherish. These contrasting priorities gradually widened the distance between them. As Paul continued guiding the band's musical direction, George became increasingly frustrated by what he believed was a lack of recognition for his own songwriting abilities. For years, his compositions had existed in the shadow of the famous Lennon-McCartney partnership. By the end of the decade, George was no longer willing to accept that position. His confidence had grown enormously, and his determination to be recognized as an equal songwriter would soon change the relationship between the two friends forever. By 1969, the friendship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison had reached its most difficult point. The Beatles, once united by youthful excitement and a shared dream, were now struggling under the weight of fame, pressure, and conflicting personalities. The recording sessions for Let It Be exposed tensions that had been building for years. Cameras documenting the band's work captured uncomfortable exchanges, revealing how strained the atmosphere had become. Paul, determined to keep the group productive, frequently directed rehearsals and offered detailed instructions on how each part should be played. While he believed he was helping the band create its best work, George increasingly felt that his own ideas and creativity were being pushed aside. One moment during those rehearsals perfectly illustrated the growing divide. After listening to another series of instructions from Paul, George calmly responded, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." Although his words were spoken quietly, they carried years of frustration. George no longer felt like an equal member of the Beatles. He had matured into a talented guitarist and songwriter, yet he believed his opinions rarely carried the same weight as Paul's. Away from the cameras, George had been writing songs that reflected his remarkable artistic growth. Compositions such as All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run-of-the-Mill proved that he had developed into a songwriter capable of standing alongside Lennon and McCartney. Unfortunately, many of these songs were overlooked during Beatles recording sessions. The partnership of Lennon and McCartney continued to dominate the albums, leaving George with limited opportunities to showcase the music he believed in most. Eventually, the frustration became impossible to ignore. On January 10, 1969, George quietly walked out of the rehearsals, deciding he could no longer remain in an environment that had become emotionally exhausting. Later, he admitted that staying with the band had become unhealthy and deeply unhappy. Although John Lennon had spoken about leaving the Beatles before, George's departure created genuine alarm. The remaining members suddenly realized how essential he was, not simply as the lead guitarist, but as one of the three musicians whose chemistry had defined the Beatles from the very beginning. After 12 days away, George agreed to return and continue working with the band. However, his brief departure changed everything. The trust that had once held the group together had been damaged, and the emotional wounds would never fully heal. Around that same period, George wrote Wah Wah, a song inspired by the frustration and pressure he experienced inside the Beatles. The lyrics reflected his growing belief that the creative environment had become suffocating. Later that year, Paul privately admitted during a conversation with John Lennon that George's songwriting had reached the same level as their own. He acknowledged that Harrison's recent compositions were every bit as strong as the work produced by the famous Lennon-McCartney partnership. George, however, rejected the idea that he had suddenly become a great songwriter. He insisted he had always possessed that ability and believed his songs had simply been overlooked for years. The disagreement highlighted the different ways the two men viewed the past. Paul believed George had gradually grown into an exceptional songwriter over time, while George felt his talent had existed all along and had never received the recognition it deserved. Those conflicting perspectives deepened the resentment between them and reinforced George's belief that he had spent too many years living in the shadow of his famous bandmates. George poured many of these emotions into his solo work. His landmark 1970 album, All Things Must Pass, became both a musical triumph and a personal statement. Among its songs was Run of the Mill, whose lyrics appeared to reflect the painful deterioration of his friendship with Paul. The words suggested disappointment, betrayal, and sadness rather than anger, revealing how deeply George valued the relationship they once shared. Although the Beatles had reached extraordinary heights together, the emotional scars left by the conflicts of 1969 would remain with both men for the rest of their lives. Ironically, just as their friendship was falling apart, George was finally receiving the artistic recognition he had long deserved. During the recording of Abbey Road, he contributed two masterpieces, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Both songs became highlights of the album and demonstrated beyond any doubt that George Harrison had become one of the finest songwriters of his generation. Something received widespread praise, with Frank Sinatra later describing it as one of the greatest love songs ever written, while John Lennon openly admitted it was among the strongest tracks on the record. For George, this success represented long-overdue validation after years of feeling overlooked. For Paul, however, it also signaled a shift in the creative balance within the Beatles. George was no longer simply the quiet guitarist supporting Lennon and McCartney. He had become an artist capable of matching them with songs of equal quality. Even so, disagreements continued behind the scenes. George often felt that Paul interfered too much with his arrangements, while Paul believed George sometimes failed to fully develop his musical ideas. They remained professional during the Abbey Road sessions, but the warmth and easy friendship of their younger years had largely disappeared. When Abbey Road was released in September 1969, the Beatles were already approaching the end of their journey together. Their official breakup came the following year. George immediately embraced his independence by releasing All Things Must Pass, a critically acclaimed triple album that astonished listeners with its emotional honesty and musical ambition. Paul also launched his solo career with the release of McCartney before later achieving further success with Wings. Both musicians proved they could thrive outside the Beatles, but their friendly competition continued long after the band had ended. Throughout the 1970s, Paul and George crossed paths only occasionally, and their relationship remained distant. George openly admitted in interviews that he found Paul difficult to work with and even remarked that he would gladly perform in a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. Although Paul rarely responded publicly, those comments clearly affected him on a personal level. Despite the lingering tension, opportunities for reconciliation occasionally appeared. In 1971, George invited Paul to participate in the historic concert for Bangladesh. Paul declined, citing concerns about the event's organization and timing. Although practical reasons influenced his decision, the refusal further widened the emotional gap between them. As the years passed, George devoted much of his attention to spirituality, personal growth, and his own musical projects, while Paul continued recording, touring, and pursuing new commercial successes. Even so, the extraordinary history they had shared could never truly disappear. Beneath the disagreements and years of silence remained a lifelong connection formed in the streets of Liverpool. That invisible bond would eventually draw them back together once again, proving that some friendships, no matter how complicated, are never completely